The summer of 1982 came to Callaway County the way hard summers always did, slowly, with a white, merciless sky and the smell of dust on the wind before the rain ever arrived. The corn was in, barely, and the beans were holding on by whatever grip God and good soil allowed them. But if you drove down Route 54 past the old Thorn place and stopped to listen, you wouldn't hear the confidence that once lived in those fields. You'd hear the tired groan of a fence post that needed replacing. You'd hear the low, distant moan of a barn that had seen one too many winters. And if it was past sundown, you'd hear the slow, rhythmic creak of a porch rocker, steady as a heartbeat, steady as the turning of the seasons themselves. That was Elias Thorne. 72 years old, he was the kind of man who had been built by the land rather than born to it, shaped by it the way a riverbank is shaped by water, slowly and without argument. His hands were the color of creek-bottom mud and twice as tough. His back had the permanent bend of a man who had spent 60 of his 72 years looking down at the earth, planting things in it, pulling things from it, talking to it in the quiet language of patience and honest work. He wore the same faded denim overalls he'd owned since 1971, the straps repaired twice with baling wire, the knees worn white. His boots had cracked along the left toe, and he had filled the crack with electrical tape, though it did precious little against a wet morning. On the radio inside the kitchen, a man's voice drifted through the screen door, tinny and slightly swallowed by static. It was Paul Harvey, or someone doing a fair impression of him, talking about the Federal Reserve and interest rates and what it all meant for the family farmer. Elias didn't need the radio to tell him what it meant. He could feel it in the letters that came from the Callaway County Farmers Bank, each one a little more clipped, a little more official, a little more final. He could feel it in the way his neighbors' fields had gone quiet one by one. Henderson sold out in 79, Miller's in 81, and old Pete Kessler had let the bank take his place last March without so much as a goodbye. The country was being wrung out like a wet rag, and the men doing the wringing wore suits and drove cars that hadn't ever known a dirt road. But Elias sat in his rocker, and in his rough hands, he held the stone. It was not a pretty thing, not by any measure a stranger might use. About the size of a cantaloupe, maybe a bit smaller, and black as a starless night. But dull black, the kind of black that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Its surface was smooth in most places, years and years of patient work having taken away the worst of its roughness, though the edges still held the memory of whatever pressure had formed it deep in the earth. Elias turned it slowly in his palms, his fingers moving over it the way a man moves his hands over something he has known a long time. He reached for the folded square of 220 grit sandpaper on the porch rail and worked a small section near what he called the shoulder of the stone, a slightly raised ridge that curved across one face, like a sleeping man's collarbone. The sound it made was barely a sound at all. A soft, dry whisper. S-H-H-H-H, S-H-H-H-H. Like the stone itself was asking for quiet. He had found it in the spring of 1942, which was itself a year that asked hard things of everyone. He'd been 22 years old, newly married to Martha Caldwell of Oz, and they were trying to bring an extra 4 acres into cultivation on the back 40. Land that had been lying fallow since his father's time because it sat atop a thick shelf of hardpan clay that broke plow blades the way a hard man breaks promises. He'd been working a borrowed mule and a turning plow, working by feel as much as by sight, when the blade caught something and the mule lurched and the handle came back and caught him hard across the wrist. He'd cursed, which he rarely did, and knelt down in the turned red earth to see what had stopped him. It looked like nothing, just a rock, black and ugly and heavy, sitting in the broken clay like it had been waiting there for him specifically. He tried to kick it aside and couldn't. He dug around it with his hands, and it came up larger than he'd expected, heavy, dense, with a kind of gravity to it that seemed out of proportion to its size. He'd hauled it out of the ground and held it in the afternoon light, and something had made him stop. Something in the way the dull black surface seemed to have depth to it, like looking into a pool of water at night. Like there was something sleeping inside. He'd carried it back to the house and set it on the porch rail, and Martha had come out drying her hands on her apron and looked at it and said, without any particular ceremony, "That's something, isn't it?" Not a question, just the simple statement of a woman who trusted her instincts. He'd started polishing it that same evening. He didn't know why exactly. A man on a working farm doesn't have a lot of room for doing things without a clear reason. But sometimes a thing gets into your hands, and your hands just know what to do with it. He'd used coarse sandpaper at first, then finer and finer grits over the years, until the outer surface had taken on a kind of muted sheen, still dark, still unrevealing, but smoother than river glass. 40 years. He hadn't cut it, hadn't broken it open, hadn't shown it to any geologist or rock expert or university professor. A few people had asked him over the years what he thought was inside it, and he'd answered with the same silence he gave to most questions that didn't require words. Martha had never pushed him. She'd understood, the way she understood most things, that some things needed their own time. She'd been gone 6 years now. When in the February of '76, quietly, the way she'd done most things in her life. The winter fields had been frozen solid and the ground too hard to dig, and Elias had sat in this same rocker for 2 weeks without leaving the porch except to do chores, and he'd polished the stone every night, and he'd felt somehow that she was still there beside him as long as his hands kept moving. The screen door banged, and his grandson Tommy came out onto the porch in his cut-off jeans and a concert t-shirt that said AC/DC on the front in jagged red letters. He was 18, thin as a fence post, with Martha's eyes and Elias's jaw, and he was carrying 2 bottles of Coca-Cola from the refrigerator. He handed one to Elias without being asked and stood at the porch rail, looking out at the fields in the long blue dusk. "Grandpa," Tommy said, not unkindly, "you know what the guys in town say about you and that rock." "I expect I do," Elias said. "They say you're—" Tommy stopped, had the decency to look a little ashamed. "They say you're not all there anymore." Elias took a slow pull on the Coke, cold and sweet, and set it on the rail beside him. He turned the stone once in his hands, feeling the smoothness of it, the deep weight of it. "Your great-grandmother used to say," he said at last, his voice low and unhurried as a creek in July, "that the best things take the longest to become what they are." He paused. She wasn't wrong about much. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, because he was 18 and couldn't help himself, he went inside to play the radio louder. Elias sat in the dark and polished the stone, and the fireflies came up out of the bean rows like slow green sparks, and the night settled over Callaway County the way it always had, indifferent to debt and interest rates and the ambitions of men in suits. Arthur Vance drove a 1981 Cadillac sedan DeVille the color of government cheese, and it was the kind of car that had no business being on a gravel farm road. It bottomed out on the drainage ditch crossing at the end of Elias's lane and left a black scratch along its undercarriage that Vance would discover later and briefly mourn. He parked in the yard beside the old Ford F-100, which was red once, before rust had made it a different kind of art, and sat for a moment with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing, composing himself the way men do when they're about to do something they've told themselves is just business. He was 45 years old, Arthur Vance, newly promoted to credit manager at Callaway County Farmers Bank after 7 years of working his way up from a branch in Columbia. He had a degree in finance from Mizzou, a wife who drove a Volvo, and children who played tennis. He did not dislike farmers, exactly. He simply could not understand a way of thinking that did not include exit strategies and quarterly projections. To Arthur Vance, a farm was an underperforming asset. It was as simple and as cold as that. He got out of the car. The heat hit him immediately, real Missouri August heat, the kind that has weight to it. And he straightened his tie and picked his way across the yard toward the porch, stepping around a coil of irrigation pipe and a rusting disc harrow that sat beside the barn like a retired soldier. Elias was on the porch. Of course he was on the porch. He was in the rocker with a coffee mug in one hand and the stone in his lap, and he watched Arthur Vance cross his yard with the slow, assessing look of a man who has lived long enough to recognize trouble at 100 yards. "Mr. Thorne," Arthur said, coming up the steps. He extended his hand. Elias shook it once, briefly, the way you shake a hand when you're being polite but not welcoming. "Mr. Vance." He didn't offer him a seat. Arthur set his briefcase on the porch rail, which Elias didn't appreciate, though he said nothing, and opened it, and produced a document, several pages, clipped together with a binder clip. He set it on top of the briefcase and smoothed it with his palm, the gesture of a man who feels more comfortable with paper than with people. "I'll be direct with you," Arthur said. "The bank has been patient with this account for 3 years. The last two partial payments don't cover the accrued interest, and at current rates, he mentioned a number. Then another number. The numbers were the kind that have the same effect as a hard winter. They don't kill you outright, but they make clear that time is no longer on your side. Elias said nothing. He picked up the stone from his lap and turned it in his hands. The morning light caught its dull surface and gave it nothing back. Arthur pressed on, because silence made him uncomfortable and discomfort made him talk. He talked about real estate values in Callaway County, about a developer out of St. Louis who was looking at agricultural parcels along this stretch of the county for a proposed mixed-use project. He said mixed-use project the way a man says words he has practiced in a mirror. He talked about the offer the developer was prepared to make, which was technically fair by the numbers, though both men in that moment understood that the numbers were the developer's numbers, calculated at the developer's convenience, and that the Thorn farm at honest value was worth considerably more. You'd walk away clean, Arthur said. He had the grace, at least, to say it quietly. No debt. A little left over. You could. I could what? Elias said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken. Arthur paused. You could retire. Comfortably. The word hung in the August air between them. Retire. As if a man like Elias Thorn could be separated from this ground the way you separate a walnut from its shell, cleanly, with a tool, leaving two pieces where there was once one. Elias set down the stone on the porch rail, next to Arthur's briefcase, and the two objects sat side by side for a moment. The briefcase with its brass latches and its crisp documents, and the black stone, ugly and patient and old. Then Elias reached forward and moved the stone to the other side of the rocker, away from the briefcase, as though he didn't want the two things touching. I'll need some time to look at those papers, Elias said. Of course. Arthur picked up his briefcase. He started to say something else, something with the word unfortunately in it, which is the word people use when they have made peace with someone else's misfortune. But Elias had already picked up his coffee mug and turned his eyes back to the fields, and Arthur Vance understood, for perhaps the first time in his professional life, what it felt like to be dismissed without a word. He walked back to the Cadillac. He didn't look back. He had another farm to visit before noon. Mr. Jeffrey Sterling arrived 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in early September, riding in Arthur Vance's Cadillac with his leather satchel on his lap and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was 55, large in the chest and pink in the face, with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years being the smartest person in the room and had come to mistake the room for the world. He was, by any fair accounting, one of the best gemstone appraisers in Missouri, possibly in the whole of the Central States. He'd been called to authenticate pieces for the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, had consulted for estate auctions in St. Louis and Chicago, had published 2 monographs on mineral identification that sat unread on the shelves of geology departments at 3 state universities. He knew rocks. He knew what rocks were worth and, more importantly, what they were not worth, and he considered the latter knowledge more professionally valuable than the former. He had come to Callaway County because Arthur Vance had told him about the old farmer and his stone, and Arthur Vance had framed it the way men frame things they want done, as a favor, lightly, with the unspoken understanding that the outcome was already decided and the formality of expertise merely needed to confirm it. Elias was in the yard when they arrived, greasing the front axle of the John Deere 4020 with a grease gun, his forearms brown and corded with effort. Tommy was inside, and the farm was quiet except for the diesel and dust smell of the yard and the dry rattle of cottonwood leaves along the fence line. Arthur made introductions. Elias wiped his hands on a rag and shook Sterling's hand and said nothing. I'd like to see the stone, Mr. Thorn, Sterling said, with the brisk courtesy of a doctor asking you to remove your shirt. Mr. Vance informs me you've had it for some years. Elias went to the porch and came back with the stone and set it in Sterling's extended hands. Sterling's expression as he received it was a small masterpiece of professional contempt held barely in check. He turned it over once, twice, held it up against the September sky. He produced a 10-power loop from his vest pocket and examined the surface for some time. He tapped it with his knuckle. He scratched a small area near the base with a steel tool from his kit. Then he set it down on the hood of the Cadillac, which made Arthur wince, and looked at Elias with the expression of a man about to deliver a diagnosis that is bad for the patient but vindicating for the doctor. Mr. Thorn, he said, I'll spare you the technical terminology, though I am happy to elaborate if you'd like. What you have here is a piece of black chert, silica-based sedimentary rock, with some surface mineral intrusion, possibly manganese oxide, which accounts for the color. It is not uncommon in the limestone and dolomite formations of central Missouri. He paused. It is, I'm afraid, entirely without gem value. He said it with kindness, which was worse than if he'd said it with contempt. 40 years, Sterling continued. And here he made his mistake, because he let the condescension get ahead of the kindness. Is a considerable amount of time to invest in a piece of farm debris. I have seen similar specimens used as doorstops. He smiled, and the smile was the kind that has never once laughed at itself. I don't say this to be unkind. I say it because a man of your years deserves an honest accounting. Tommy had come out onto the porch somewhere in the middle of this speech, and Elias heard the screen door and knew it. He didn't look back at the boy. He kept his eyes on Sterling with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who has been watching weather long enough to know that every kind of sky passes. A man of my years, Elias said. Yes. Sterling picked up the stone and turned it once more, performing now for his own satisfaction rather than for information. Polishing the exterior, as you have done, is craftsmanlike work, I'll grant you. But it doesn't change what's inside. He set the stone back down on the car hood. Elias reached forward and picked it up and held it in both hands. And the way he held it, close to his chest, the way you hold something that belongs to you, was the only answer he gave to everything Sterling had just said. Arthur Vance looked at Elias with the expression of a man who expects surrender and is rehearsing his sympathy for when it comes. Elias held the stone and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, I believe I'll cut it now. The tool shed stood back behind the barn, a low building of corrugated tin that smelled of 30-weight oil and old sawdust, and the particular dry sweetness of machinery that has been used hard and maintained well. Elias had built it in 1959 with lumber milled off his own trees, and it held, among other things, a 1955 Highland Park Model 10 trim saw, a lapidary machine, technically, designed for cutting rock and gemstone, fitted with a diamond blade and a water feed system to keep the blade cool. He had bought it secondhand in 1963 from a retired schoolteacher in Fulton who'd taken up rockhounding in his retirement, and he had kept it in working order for 19 years with nothing more than occasional blade replacements and careful attention to the water reservoir. He had never used it on the stone. He carried the stone into the shed and set it on the work table. He checked the water level in the reservoir. Full, which meant Tommy had been using it for something and had the good sense to refill it. He plugged in the machine and let it run without the blade engaged for a moment, listening to it, feeling for anything wrong in the motor's sound. It ran clean. He nodded. Arthur Vance and Jeffrey Sterling had followed him to the shed, because neither man could quite locate the authority to tell him not to, and because something in Elias's manner had, for the first time that afternoon, made them uncertain. Tommy stood in the shed doorway with his arms folded, watching his grandfather with an expression that was one part hope and one part the complicated love of a young person for an old one. Elias positioned the stone in the machine's sliding vise. He adjusted it with care, finding the plane he wanted, the shoulder ridge, the one he'd been thinking about for 40 years. He had not made this decision lightly or quickly. He had made it the night before, alone on the porch in the dark, with the stone in his lap and the katydids going in the oaks, and he had felt something that was not certainty exactly, but was close to it, the way a farmer feels the soil in early May and knows in his bones that it's time to plant. He engaged the blade. The sound was enormous in the small shed, a high, hard scream of diamond against stone, and then water spraying in a thin arc, pink-white droplets catching the light from the bare bulb overhead. The blade bit in and held, and Elias kept his pressure steady and even, the way a man holds a plow through hard ground, neither forcing it nor letting it wander. Arthur Vance had taken a half-step back without noticing it. Sterling stood with his arms at his sides, watching with the careful attention of a professional who cannot quite prevent himself from being interested. The cut took 4 minutes, maybe 5. Time in that shed seemed to run at a different speed. When the blade had traveled its full arc and the stone was cut through, Elias switched off the machine, and the silence came back like a held breath released. He removed the two halves from the vise and set them on the work table, cut faces up, and for a moment he did not look at them. He wiped his hands on the same rag he'd been carrying all day. Then he stepped back and let the light from the overhead bulb fall across what was inside. It is difficult, afterward, for anyone who was in that shed to describe precisely what they saw in the first second. The language for it is inadequate, and the people who were there have said so, in their different ways, at different times. What the blade had opened was not what the exterior of the stone had promised. The black was gone, or rather it had been a shell, a casing, a 40-year patience wrapped around something that had nothing to do with ordinary geology. The interior of the stone was afire. Not metaphorically, not in the way people say that about something bright or beautiful. The interior was a black opal of a scale and quality that Jeffrey Sterling, in 30 years of handling precious stones on 3 continents, had never seen. The base color was a deep, velvet black, and across its face ran sheets and rivers and explosions of color, red and green and electric blue, shifting as the light moved, as your angle changed, as your eyes tried to hold what they were seeing. There were colors in it that seemed to have no names, or rather names that belonged to other things. The color of heat lightning over a flat field at midnight, the color of a dragonfly wing held against the sun, the color of deep water in a limestone cave. It moved. The colors moved. The gems seemed to be lit from some internal source that had nothing to do with the bare bulb overhead or the afternoon light at the door. Later, Sterling would write in his professional notes that the specimen was a black crystal opal of extraordinary size, approximately 380 carats in the larger half alone, with play of color rated at 5 out of 5 on the standard assessment scale, covering the full spectral range, in what he described as a rolling flash pattern of exceptional brightness. He would write that it was the finest specimen of its kind he had ever examined, and that its formation in a Missouri context was, geologically speaking, essentially inexplicable, which was as close as a man of his training would come to saying that some things are beyond what the instruments can measure. But that was later. In the shed, what Jeffrey Sterling did was different. He made a sound. It was not a professional sound. It was not the considered observation of an expert. It was the sound a man makes when something he has been certain of all his life turns out to be wrong, and the wrongness is not small. He stepped forward and put both hands on the workbench to steady himself. His face, which had been pink, had gone a kind of gray-white. He tried to pick up one of the halves, and his hands were not steady enough to do it. He tried to say something, one word, possibly a number, possibly just a name. And instead his legs made a quiet decision without consulting the rest of him. And Jeffrey Sterling, senior appraiser, published author, expert of 30 years standing, sat down on the dirt floor of Elias Thorne's tool shed as though his bones had simply stopped believing in themselves. He did not exactly faint. He remained conscious, or nearly so. But he sat in the dirt with his back against the workbench and his expensive jacket acquiring the fine red dust of a Missouri August. And he looked up at the 2 halves of the stone on the table above him with the expression of a man who has just been shown the inside of something he spent his life claiming to understand. Arthur Vance had gone very still. The document in his briefcase, the one with the developer's numbers on it, the one that would have converted the Thorne farm into a mixed-use commercial project, might as well have been in another county. He looked at Elias, and Elias looked back at him. And in the silence between them 40 years of patience and 40 years of hurry regarded each other across a workbench, and the hurry did not have anything left to say. Tommy was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. His arms had come uncrossed at some point, and he was gripping the doorframe with both hands. And his face was doing something complicated that involved pride and grief and the realization, arriving all at once, that his grandfather had known something for a very long time that Tommy had not. Elias picked up both halves of the stone and held them together for a moment, the cut faces touching, as if completing a sentence. Then he set them carefully down and covered them with the clean rag he kept on the work table. He looked at Arthur Vance. "I believe," he said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, "that we are done with the foreclosure papers." There was a man in St. Louis, a proper gemologist attached to an auction house on Olive Street, who came out to the farm in October of that year and spent the better part of a day examining both halves of the stone. He was a careful man, methodical, and he did not say much while he worked, which Elias respected. When he was finished, he sat at Elias's kitchen table and drank a cup of coffee and told Elias, in plain terms, what it was worth. Elias listened. He did not change expression. When the man was done talking, Elias asked him one question, which was whether a sale could be handled quietly, without newspapers or television or the kind of attention that follows money into a small town like floodwater through a gap in a levee. The man said that it could. He had done discreet work before. He understood. Elias shook his hand, and the man drove back to St. Louis, and the farm went quiet again, and the October light came down golden and long across the bean fields, and the John Deere sat in the yard, and the porch rocker sat empty in the afternoons because Elias was too busy with the fall work to sit in it until evening. He did not tell Tommy the number. He did not tell anyone the number. Later, the county clerk's records would show that the mortgage on the Thorne farm was discharged in full in November of 1982, and that Elias Thorne had that same month purchased 3 adjoining parcels of farmland that had gone into bank foreclosure. The Henderson place, which had been in the Henderson family since 1911, the old Kessler farm, which Pete Kessler had signed over to the bank in the spring, and the lower 40 of the Miller property, which the Miller boys had been trying to sell since their father's death and couldn't, because who was buying farmland in Missouri in 1982 except developers at insulting prices? He did not develop any of it. He put the Hendersons back on their land. Their son Dale had been working a warehouse in Jefferson City for 2 years, not by choice, and he came back in December with his family and his father's old equipment and a determination that had something fierce and grateful in it. He kept the Kessler place in a land lease arrangement that charged Pete Kessler nothing for the first 3 years and a nominal amount afterward, on the theory that a man who had worked land his whole life should not have to stop on account of a banker's arithmetic. The Miller 40 he folded into his own operation, because the drainage was good and the ground wanted corn. There was a reporter from the Columbia Missourian who heard something. Eventually, rumors travel in small counties the way seeds travel on wind, without asking permission, and she drove out to the farm on a gray November morning and knocked on the porch door and asked Elias if he'd be willing to talk about the stone and what had happened. He offered her a cup of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window while she drank it and looked out at the field, where Tommy was driving the tractor along the south fence line, checking the wire before winter. The boy had not gone back to talking about leaving for the city since September. He hadn't said why, and Elias hadn't asked. Some things don't need to be discussed. Mr. Thorne, the reporter said, with her notebook open on the table. Can you tell me what it felt like, after 40 years, to finally cut the stone? To be proven right? Elias considered the question for a long time, long enough that the reporter began to wonder if he'd heard it. Then he said, I wasn't trying to prove anything. He refilled her coffee. She waited. Martha, my wife, she used to say that a patient man isn't waiting for something to happen. He's just giving it room. He looked out the window again. I gave it room. The reporter wrote that down. She asked a few more questions, and he answered some of them briefly and declined the rest with a quiet courtesy that made arguing feel beside the point. When she left, she wrote a small piece that ran on an inside page of the Missourian, which was picked up by one-wire service and disappeared, as most honest things do, into the general current of news. Arthur Vance was transferred to a branch office in Sedalia the following spring, for reasons the bank described as organizational restructuring, and no one in Callaway County asked for more detail than that. The Cadillac was eventually replaced by a Ford, which was the county's only comment on the matter. Jeffrey Sterling recovered himself, eventually, and the letter he wrote to Elias in January of 1983 was, by the accounts of the one person who ever saw it, which was Tommy, a remarkable document, 3 pages long, in which Sterling said several things that a man of his professional disposition rarely commits to paper. He said that he had been wrong, which was the least of it. He said that there were things in the ground that did not follow the rules that men who study the ground have written for it, and that this should perhaps be humbling to all of them. He said, at the very end, that he thought Elias must have known all along, not in the way a scientist knows a thing, with instruments and data, but in the other way, the one that has no name. Elias read the letter on the porch, in the rocker, on a cold January evening with a blanket across his knees. He read it through twice. Then he set it on the rail and looked out at the frozen fields, blue-white in the last light. And he thought about Martha, the way she'd stood in the doorway with the dish towel in her hands looking at the stone on the porch rail in 1942, and the way she'd said, "That's something, isn't it?" without any doubt in her voice at all, without even having to think about it. He put the letter inside with the others. He did not reply to it, but not out of rudeness. It simply didn't need an answer. Some letters are written to be sent, not to receive a response. He understood that. By February, the Henderson boy had got his tractor running again and had put in a winter cover crop on his fields, and the green of it coming up through a light snow was, in its small way, one of the better things Elias had seen in some years. He made a point of driving the truck past the Henderson fields on his way back from town most mornings, just to see it. Come spring, he planted corn. He didn't plan it with any particular ceremony or self-consciousness. He climbed up on the 40/20 in the early gray of a late April morning, the engine turning over with that deep, diesel heartbeat that had been the rhythm of his days for 30 years, and he drove out to the south field and started at the fence line and worked his way north, row by row, the planter laying seed into ground that was warm enough and willing. Tommy drove the second pass on the old case, which they'd gotten running again over the winter, and the two of them worked the field in the quiet companionship of people who have found, without making a speech about it, something worth doing together. The radio in the cab played KFRU out of Columbia, and sometime around mid-morning they put on a Merle Haggard song that Elias had always liked, something about working men and the places they came from, and the things they carried forward without being asked to, and he turned it up a notch and drove his row, and did not think about foreclosure notices or Cadillacs or appraisers' reports. He thought about the stone, a little, not about its value, which was a number he had by now filed in the same mental drawer he kept for things that mattered without mattering too much. He thought about the 40 years of evenings on the porch, the sandpaper moving in slow circles, the stone giving back almost nothing all that time, and then, in the end, giving back everything. He thought about the way patience is different from waiting. Waiting is what you do when you expect something. Patience is what you do when you trust something, and the difference between those two things is the whole distance between a man who is disappointed and a man who is not. The corn went in by the end of April, straight and even, row after row after row, crossing the field the way sentences cross a page, carrying meaning that is simple on the surface and not simple at all underneath. The stone, or rather the two halves of it, cleaned and fitted with a simple wooden mount, sat on the mantelpiece in the front room, above the fireplace, between a photograph of Martha in the summer of 1953 and the bronze star that Elias's father had brought back from France in 1918 and never talked about. Visitors, when they came, sometimes noticed the stone and sometimes didn't. Elias never pointed it out. The farm held. The seasons turned. The fields filled and emptied and filled again, and the porch rocker creaked in the long summer evenings. And somewhere in Callaway County, on a night when the air smelled of new rain and turned earth and the particular sweetness of a farm at the end of a good working day, you could hear it, just barely, if you were quiet enough. That steady, patient creak, telling you that some things were worth keeping. That some things, if you gave them enough room, became what they always were. That the land remembers, even when we forget to.